Hello, Phil here from Wings of Pegasus and welcome to another analysis video. If you enjoy this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. On the agenda tonight, we're going back to 1967. We're going to be taking a look at the Mamas and the Papas, and they're going to be performing California Dreamin'. So let's get the guys up on screen and see how they get on. And there we have it. So a few things to point out from this performance is that Cass Elliott's mic is definitely on. We can hear her backing vocals, but it sounds like Michelle Phillips' vocal mic isn't turned on. It might be that she's a bit too far away from the microphone, so we're not getting the 4-part harmonies, which are so important in this composition, and the way that the voices blend together, especially when you're listening to the recorded version. And sometimes you can be singing on stage thinking everything's great, but then out of the front of house, there might be something really low in the mix, like a harmony vocal that isn't there, but you can't tell because on stage it all sounds great. This is something that does happen quite a lot, where you have something called foldback, which are speakers that are pointed towards the performers, and when you're singing, you'll get your own voice projected back at you at a loud volume so you can hear what's going on. So taking into consideration that we can't hear Michelle's vocal, we're missing out on 25% of the vocal sound here. Cass is so solid with her lower harmony parts, and it really does miss the soprano range that Michelle has in order to throw in those top notes to give that dramatic impact of the chorus. And this as a composition, by the way, I'm just going to mention John Phillips, who is the principal writer, was the principal writer for the Mamas and the Papas, and he's written some amazing songs. This is just one of them, but putting it together, the way it's been composed, just going up and down those stairs, if that's what we're imagining in terms of pitch, we're always going up and then coming down pitch-wise, and then our top notes are always hit harmony-wise from Michelle with her range in the end of the chorus, the California Dreamin' on such a winter's day. Day, the last word of that chorus, is going to be where the highest note is. I think this is one of the gigs where they were slightly criticized because this was at the Monterey Pop Festival, and especially if it's getting judged on the fact that you can't hear all of the band to begin with, it's always going to be criticized because you're not actually hearing what's on the record because of a technical malfunction, and that isn't the band's fault. The 3 vocal mics that are working here are really dry as well, meaning there's no effect on them. If we compare that with the original recording, those microphones in the studio were really wet in terms of having lots of reverb on there that really embellished the sound. So having dry mics means that the vocals are really under the spotlight, under the microscope. Fortunately, because Cass is so accurate with those backing harmonies, and also Denny is so accurate with that lead vocal, belting it out in chest voice, it really does come across well. I think a lot of people don't realize that we're missing a voice here, so that's why they might think, oh, it doesn't sound like the original, but they can definitely all nail it live. Just to put the spotlight on John Phillips here, like I mentioned, the principal songwriter, and in this performance playing guitar, singing, backing vocals, but also doubling up on that lead vocal in sections. Writing the songs is the hardest part, and when you are writing songs and arranging them for 4 voices, you really have to know what you're doing melodically, and to make a journey out of those songs, to make them interesting, the lyrical content. John is really the engine that's driving the melody within these songs, but then also writing them in such a way that it can be worked 4 ways. And when I mention about other bands who have a singer, and then what an advantage it is to have somebody else in the band who can sing and harmonize with that lead vocalist, and then I say sometimes if you're really lucky you might have 3 vocalists that can also do that. Here we've got 4 vocalists, and it is a luxury to have that. And sometimes you might have one vocalist who isn't as good as the other vocalists, but here not only have we got great vocals all the way across the board, but we've got different ranges, which is so important to get a full sound, because it means that everybody can be singing different notes and they're not straining to hit those notes because that's where their voices sit. And a great example is Cass's vocal here that you can hear is pretty low down, but then if we were able to hear Michelle's vocals, there'd be soprano, there'd be higher. So those 2 voices working with each other will give such a full sound. And then we've got the male voices, which will just naturally sit lower than Cass's voice. I've mentioned a lot recently about the call and response that is so prevalent in songs and all the big hits in order to make a conversation out of the song, to make it interesting. And the Mamas and the Papas are a classic example of implementing that technique, especially with this song, because we get a repeat of the line. We always get a response to that lead vocal line. So it is like listening to a conversation, especially once you start adding in the female vocals and the male vocals. If you have the male vocal singing the first line and then the female vocal singing in the second line, it's just going to accentuate that call and response because it's a different voice. Often you'll have that second voice being supplied by a lead instrument, such as a guitar line, that if somebody's singing and playing guitar, they'll sing and then they'll play a lead line on their guitar as the response. But here we get such an authentic call and response because of the different ranges and the different sounds of the male and the female vocal. But then also the dynamic changes that are written in there. For example, after the high note in the chorus, the very last word of the chorus, we then drop down into the verse. And this is when Denny comes in with, I stepped into a church, yeah, I passed along the way. Well, I got down on my knees. And you can hear the gaps that are in there. I hope I'm not going to get a copyright strike for singing the words, but just to demonstrate how the gaps are written into the composition to allow the audience to digest the melody, the music, and the lyrical content. The audience need that thinking time, and because we've just been all in with the chorus, They need that dramatic change just to keep it interesting. You don't want to be attacking the audience all the time. In this particular live performance as well, we do have a lead guitar solo that takes the place of the flute that is on the original recording, and it's a lot of alternate picking going on here, which means that if you are throwing in a lot of alternate picking and you do miss some, it is going to stick out, but it's just to fill in that sound because the tone here is really clean. I don't want this video to go on for too long, but I do want to cover some of the background of the Mamas and the Papas because they were one of those bands that weren't around for a very long time. Between 1965 and 1968, they did do another album in 1971, and that was to fulfill the contract that they had signed, but they weren't all in the studio at the same time being a band. They came in separately and just laid down their parts in order to fulfill that contract. So it all started in 1964 when John and Michelle, who were married, they had their own band with Denny as well, playing folk music. And it wasn't until 1965 that Cass then joined the band. And I think John has some reservations image-wise about Cass, but fortunately they managed to look past that and realise they made a great sound together. So they went to the Virgin Islands in 1965 to get everything organised and rehearse and really work out their direction as a band. That was the first year that they did anything electric because it was all folk music before that. So after this period in the Virgin Islands, they went to New York for an audition with Lou Adler, who was the co-owner of Dunhill Records at the time, and this was organised through their friend Barry Maguire, and he had just been signed by Dunhill Records, so he managed to get their foot in the door with Lou Adler. So after a successful audition, they did sign a recording contract, and this now made them a band. I think Cass wasn't officially part of the band, or at least hadn't signed anything until this point to signify that fact. So they did sign a deal, and that was for 5 albums in all at 2 albums a year, and it was for 5% of the royalties. That's all the band got, and that included publishing and distribution, management. They signed in to everything, so the record label has 95% of any money made from everything, and that's pretty much how record labels work and still work to this day. So their first single was called Go Where You Wanna Go, and unfortunately that didn't chart. The follow-up single did a little bit better because that was California Dreamin', and that got to number 4 in the USA and number 23 in the UK. Interestingly, the first single that they did release, Go Where You Wanna Go, turned into a top 20 hit for Fifth Dimension. So that debut album in 1966 was called If You Can Believe Your Eyes and Ears, and that had California Dreamin' on it, and it also had Monday Monday, which was released as a single, and that was a monster hit. Got to number 1 in the USA and number 3 in the UK. And that same year, they released their second album, and that was called The Mamas and the Papas. And interestingly, on that album cover, for some reason, Denny's name is spelt with an I-E at the end rather than a Y, and I don't know why that happened. But the Mamas and the Papas were one of those bands that had a lot of turmoil within the band, because in mid-1966, Michelle was fired from the band because she had had an affair with Gene Clark from the Byrds, and John, being her husband, wasn't happy about that, obviously, and wanted to fire her from the band, and it all kicked off. The other two did agree with John, so unfortunately, in June of 1966, Michelle was axed from the Mamas and the Papas. So they went about replacing Michelle, and they got Jill Gibson involved. Unfortunately, it didn't work out with Jill. I'm sure that the vocal sound wasn't the same as Michelle, and they would have been used to Michelle. So a couple of months later, Michelle was back in the band, and this is still in 1966, where the album was doing really well. It got to number 4 in the USA and to number 24 in the UK. So it was a hit album, that second album, and there's a track on that album called I Saw Her Again. And a little fact about this is that right at the end of the song, there was a mistake in the studio where the producer accidentally tracked the last chorus too early, so you can hear the vocal "I saw her" come in too early. But they just thought it sounded good, so they kept that on the recording and pressed it, and that is, as everybody now knows, the track. In 1967, they released The Mamas and the Papas Deliver, and that was another hit album. It got to number 2 in the charts, and the next album after that was called The Papas and the Mamas, and that was the album that was recorded in John's attic, because John had bought all of the studio equipment, so he now had total creative control. And the only problem was that John was an obsessive perfectionist, which meant that he spent a lot of time on the recordings, wouldn't release anything until he was absolutely happy with it. And this caused a bit of tension in the band because it was taking so long to get these songs down. So the recording process was a point of contention. I can really see it from both angles, because you've got John, who really wants to make everything as perfect as possible before it's released, but he's also writing the songs, arranging the songs, he's mixing it, he's producing it, doing everything himself, so it is taking a long time. But you've got the other viewpoint from Cass, who said to Rolling Stone that she did her whole album in 3 weeks in terms of her solo album, but all of those songs on her solo album were covers, so the band could set up and play them, and she could sing it in 1 take or 2 takes, and it only took a few weeks. So she wasn't composing the songs, arranging them, and producing them, mixing them, doing all of those things that take so long. So I'm sure she really didn't understand the process of being a songwriter from scratch. If you said to Cass, write an album, produce it, arrange it, do everything, write the lyrics, write the melodies, write the 4-part harmonies, and do it all in 3 weeks. Here's the equipment, go and do it. I'm sure she would struggle to do it. It's the different views of the recording process that one artist has and another artist has that they really didn't see eye to eye on. When the tension was rising because of all of these issues with recording, in 1967 they did say that they were going to take a break, and I think another part of that was that Cass was arrested in the UK for stealing some linen from a hotel or something. I think the main reason was not because of the linen, but because the hotel room bill hadn't been paid because she left somebody else in charge of it. And then Cass was trying to tell this story to Mick Jagger at a party, but then John interrupted her and she started screaming at John and they fell out, and that's why they then took a break. But in 1968, they did make up and finish the album. So you could start to see the direction that things were going in, because in 1968, Mama Cass released her version of Dream a Little Dream of Me. And on that single cover, it said Mama Cass with the Mamas and the Papas. So John obviously wasn't very happy about this. If you've seen that single cover as well, you'll notice that the Mamas and the Papas is in red and you can't really read it, but the Mama Cass at the top left is really clear. But they still owed the record label for one more album, and the record label threatened to sue each member of the Mamas and the Papas individually for $250,000. So a cool $1 million overall. Obviously, the guys then got together. They didn't get together. They recorded an album in John's studio independently, just turning up one by one to record their parts, and then they would all go their separate ways. And that was the album that was called People Like Us, that was released in 1971. But bringing it back to this live performance, which is a solid live performance considering the technical difficulties that they're having with Michelle's mic. And the Mamas and the Papas were one of those bands that weren't around for a great deal of time, but they had so many hits while they were recording and releasing songs into the charts. And a lot of that is down to John and his ability as a songwriter. But thank you guys so much for suggesting this video for me to take a look at, and keep those suggestions coming in the comments below. Let me know what you guys think, and if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe, and I'll see you guys at the next one. Rock!